Blackwood's voice cut through the staging area like a blade. "Command sent us a doll," he said loud enough that every man in the bay could hear it. Laughter spread through SEAL Team Viper, the way fire spreads through dry brush, fast, total, and without apology. Specialist Hallie Thorne stood at 4 feet 9 inches and did not flinch. She had heard worse. She would prove more. If you're watching this story for the first time, hit that subscribe button and follow every part to the end, because what this soldier does in a sandstorm 3,000 meters from her targets will leave you stunned. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Hallie Thorne arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, the desert was already in a bad mood. The heat came off the ground in thick, invisible waves that made the distant ridgelines shimmer like a mirage, and the wind carried fine grit that found its way into everything. Rifle mechanisms, water bottles, the corners of your eyes if you weren't careful. It was the kind of morning that tested patience before a single round was fired, and the men of SEAL Team Viper had already decided, before her transport vehicle stopped rolling, that the day was going to get worse. Hallie stepped down from the vehicle with her pack across her shoulders and her rifle case in her left hand. She was wearing the same sand-colored utilities as everyone else on the base. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her face gave nothing away. She stood still for exactly 3 seconds, the way a person does when they're letting their eyes adjust and read a new environment, and then she started walking toward the staging area where Team Viper was assembled. Chief Petty Officer Deke Kruger saw her first. He was leaning against a support beam with a protein bar in one hand and a water bottle in the other, and when Hallie came through the gate, he stopped chewing. He didn't say anything immediately. He just watched her cross the distance, and the silence he kept was almost worse than what came next, because it was the silence of a man who was choosing his words for maximum damage. "Well," Kruger finally said loud enough for the 6 men around him to catch it, "Command's getting creative." That drew heads up. 4 SEALs who had been checking equipment or reviewing maps turned and looked. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Torres, tilted his head like he wasn't sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. Hallie did not change her pace. She walked directly to the equipment table, set her rifle case down with deliberate care, and began checking the log sheet for her assigned bunk assignment and briefing time. Captain Garrett Blackwood came out of the ops tent 30 seconds later. He was a big man, 6'2", with the kind of build that came from years of physical discipline and very little else to think about, and he had the confidence of someone who had operated in enough dangerous places that he'd stopped registering fear as a irrelevant sensation. He saw Hallie at the equipment table. He stopped. He looked at Kruger. Kruger shrugged. Blackwood walked over, crossed his arms, and stood just close enough to make the interaction feel like a confrontation rather than a greeting. "Thorne," he said. "Sir," she said, not looking up from the log sheet. "Specialist Hallie Thorne, Scout Sniper, attached to this element for Operation Viper Strike." "That's correct." "How tall are you, Specialist?" She looked up at him then. Her expression was completely level. 4 feet 9, sir." Blackwood held her gaze for a long moment. Behind him, someone made a sound that was trying very hard not to be a laugh and failing. Torres turned away. Kruger did not bother hiding it at all. "Right," Blackwood said. He uncrossed his arms and turned back toward the ops tent. "Make sure she gets the full briefing packet. She's going to need time to read all the words." The laughter that came after that was open and unashamed. Hallie went back to the log sheet. She signed her name in the correct box, picked up her rifle case, and walked toward the bunk room without responding. She had heard worse. She would prove more. The bunk room, assigned to her, was a converted storage space with a cot, a locker, and a single window that looked out over the motor pool. Hallie set her rifle case on the cot and began running through her standard post-transit check. She broke the rifle down in a practice sequence, checked each component with the methodical focus of someone who had done this so many times that it lived in her hands rather than her head. While she worked, she could hear voices from the common area on the other side of the wall. Team Viper was not making any effort to keep their opinions quiet. "I'm not saying she can't shoot," Torres was saying. "I'm saying this is a direct action mission against a coordinated unit with a confirmed mortar capability. That is not the same thing as a qualification range." "Command's checking a box," Kruger said. "Female operator attached to SEAL element. Someone in Washington wants the press release. We run the mission. She stays in the rear. We bring her home. Everyone's happy." "What if she doesn't stay in the rear?" "She will." "What if Blackwood doesn't make that call? Blackwood's already made it. You saw his face. Hallie finished reassembling her rifle. She set it down, loaded her pack for the briefing, and did not allow herself any reaction to what she had just heard. She had known what the reaction would be before the transport vehicle had even left her last post. She had read Blackwood's file. She had read Kruger's. She had read every assessment available for every member of Team Viper, not because she expected to change their minds with information, but because understanding the people around you in a combat environment was a matter of survival. They were going to dismiss her. That had never been in question. What mattered was what happened after the dismissal. She had a plan. The mission briefing was held in the main ops tent at 1400 hours. 8 people were present: Blackwood, Kruger, Torres, 3 other Viper operators named Reese Calloway and Marsh, an air liaison officer named Lieutenant Danes and Hallie. The tent was hot despite the 2 fans running, and the smell of coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner filled the space. Blackwood ran the briefing himself. He was thorough, she gave him that. He knew the objective, knew the terrain, knew the enemy force composition based on the most recent intelligence. Operation Viper Strike was a direct action mission against a confirmed insurgent command post operating in the Canyon system, approximately 40 kilometers northeast of FOB Sentinel. The command post was supplying a network of cells responsible for 3 separate attacks on coalition logistics in the previous 6 weeks. Taking it out would disrupt the network significantly. The timeline was tight, a window of 4 hours during the following day's operational period, dependent on weather and air support availability. Blackwood pointed to the planned route on the terrain map, a canyon approach moving northeast through a narrow passage that put the team in close proximity to the objective while minimizing exposure to the open desert. Hallie studied the map while he talked. She studied it the way she studied everything, not for what it showed her, but for what it suggested. The canyon was approximately 800 meters long and nowhere wider than 60 meters at its broadest point. The ridge lines on either side rose between 40 and 70 meters above the canyon floor. The objective was at the northern end. The planned entry point was from the south. She looked at the ridge lines. She looked at the elevation markers. She looked at the objective position and the planned exit route, and then she looked at the weather notation in the corner of the briefing packet. Sandstorm advisory, she noted. Possible haboob development 14 to 2200 hours. She looked at the entry time, 1600. She raised her hand. Blackwood looked at her the way a teacher looks at a student who has interrupted a lecture they didn't ask for. Specialist. The canyon route puts the team inside a natural choke point during the storm window, she said. The ridge lines are high enough on both sides to establish effective overwatch. If the enemy has intelligence on our timeline, which their 3 previous accurate attacks on coalition logistics suggest they have everything they need to set up a coordinated ambush at the north end of the canyon before we reach the objective. The room was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that isn't agreement. It's the sound of people deciding whether to bother engaging. The canyon is the fastest approach, Blackwood said. It cuts 40 minutes off our insertion time. It also cuts off every escape route if we take contact in the passage, Hallie said. 60-meter maximum width, vertical walls on both sides. Air support is going to be blind during a haboob. If they have mortars staged on the ridge, we lose the team. Your concern is noted, Blackwood said. I'd like to propose an alternative approach, she continued, keeping her voice completely even. Hill 350 on the northwest edge of the canyon system. If we break formation before entry and move one shooter to high ground, while the primary element continues the approach you have, overwatch coverage on the entire northern ridgeline from a position that isn't inside the kill zone. Blackwood looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Kruger. Kruger picked up his coffee cup. We've run canyon approaches 17 times in the last 2 years, he said. Never lost a man. I'm aware of the record, Hallie said. Then you know the risk assessment has already been done. The risk assessment didn't account for a weather window that eliminates air support and a possible intelligence leak. The intelligence leak is speculative. 3 accurate attacks on our logistics over 6 weeks is not speculation. It's a pattern. Blackwood put both hands on the table and leaned forward. Specialist Thorne, he said, and his voice had dropped to a register that was very deliberately patient, the way adults speak to children who have asked the same question too many times. I appreciate the tactical input. The approach stands as planned. Is there anything else? She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to be clear, not long enough to become a challenge he felt he needed to answer by force. No, sir, she said. Good. He straightened up. We're wheels up at 1500 tomorrow. Get your kit squared away. She walked back to her bunk room and began preparing her kit. Not for the canyon approach, for Hill 350. She didn't sleep that night. She had slept in worse conditions and skipped sleep in worse circumstances, but this wasn't insomnia, it was preparation. She spent 3 hours reviewing every piece of terrain data available for the Hill 350 position and the northern ridgeline. She calculated firing angles. She ran the ballistic calculations for the distances involved at the expected wind speeds a haboob would produce. She studied the enemy force composition again, looking at their previous mortar deployment patterns from the 3 prior attacks. They had used the same staging setup each time. 2-man mortar crew, 4-man security element, 3-man machine gun team. 9 total. They deployed high ground whenever possible, always on the eastern side of their target. The northern ridgeline of the canyon had exactly one position that matched that profile, a flat section of rock approximately 12 meters wide, elevated 40 meters above the canyon floor, with a direct sight line down the passage. If they were setting up an ambush, that was where they would be. She set her alarm for 0400 and then sat in the dark for another 40 minutes going through the math again. 3,000 meters give or take from the summit of Hill 350 to the northern ridgeline position. That was not a standard engagement distance. That was not a distance that appeared frequently in any manual she had ever read. At standard conditions with a known wind and clear visibility, 3,000 meters was already at the edge of confirmed kill range for any sniper system currently in service. In a haboob with 50 to 60 knot wind speeds, near zero visibility, and a bullet flight time approaching 4 seconds during which the wind could shift direction entirely, it was a distance that most people would call impossible. She wrote down the calculation. Then she wrote it down again from memory to check it. Then she packed her kit. She was ready before first light. She spent the pre-dawn hours on the far side of the motor pool working through a set of physical exercises that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with control breathing patterns, hand steadiness, the micro adjustments of muscle tension that separated a cold shot from a controlled one. She had been doing this routine for 6 years since her first year at sniper school, when her instructor had told her that her greatest obstacle was not going to be ballistics or distance or wind. It was going to be the moment before the trigger when everything in your body that was designed to keep you alive started screaming at you to stop. She had learned to have a conversation with that scream instead of fighting it. Kruger found her there at 0530. He came around the corner of the motor pool with his own coffee and stopped when he saw her. She was in a low-seated position, working through a breathing cycle, and she didn't stop when he appeared. He watched for a moment. "You been out here all night?" he asked. "Since 04, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're really pushing this Hill 350 thing." "I'm preparing for the mission," she said. "The mission goes through the canyon." "I know." He drank his coffee and watched her breathe. There was something in his face that wasn't quite the open mockery he had been running since she arrived. Something more uncertain, the kind of expression a person gets when a small detail doesn't match the picture they built in their head and they're not sure what to do about it. "Blackwood's a good operator," he said finally. "Best I've served under. He's got more canyon approaches under his belt than any active SEAL element." "I don't doubt that," she said. "So what makes you think you see something he doesn't?" She finished her breathing cycle, stood up, and looked at him directly. "I'm not smarter than Captain Blackwood," she said. "I'm not more experienced. What I am is positioned differently. I came in from the outside and I read this operation with eyes that don't have 17 successful canyon approaches to draw on. Sometimes that's an advantage. Not often, but sometimes." Kruger turned Kruger turned the coffee cup in his hand. He looked like a man who wanted to say something and couldn't find the words that would let him say it without giving something up. He settled on, "Get some breakfast. We roll at 1500. He walked away. Hallie watched him go and thought that she had not changed his mind. She had not expected to. But she had introduced a doubt small and quiet into the back of a confident man's head. Whether that mattered or not would depend entirely on what the next 12 hours brought. The morning moved the way mornings before. Operations always move fast where you wanted it, slow, slow where you wanted it fast. Team Viper ran through their final equipment checks with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this enough times that the routine had become a form of confidence. She watched them work while she completed her own preparation. Torres was careful. Reese was fast. Marsh kept checking his earpiece. Calloway ran the same function check on his rifle 3 times, which Hallie recognized as a stress response rather than a mechanical concern. Kruger moved through everything with quiet authority. Blackwood was present, but not hovering the kind of command posture that said he trusted his team completely. She found herself respecting the unit even as they dismissed her. That was important. You couldn't afford contempt for the people you were operating alongside, regardless of what they thought of you. If everything went wrong, these were the people you were going to need to move in sync with. At 1300, the weather report came in. The Haboob was developing ahead of schedule. Estimated arrival at the target area between 1530 and 1600. That was earlier than the storm advisory had suggested. That meant reduced window for insertion. She watched Blackwood receive the update. She watched him look at the map. She watched him make no change to the plan. She picked up her kit. Torres caught her near the vehicle line. He was shorter than Kruger, quieter than most of the team, with a face that didn't give much away. He fell into step beside her and for a moment didn't say anything. Then he said, "Your ballistic setup, what range are you dialed for?" She looked at him. "Why, Huamin? You've been running calculations since last night." Everyone noticed. "The range on my setup is appropriate for the mission," she said. Torres nodded slowly. He wasn't going to push it further. She could tell he was working something out in his own head, and asking her directly was just part of the process. 3,000's a long way, he said finally. "Depends on the conditions," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Yeah," and went back to his vehicle. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement she had received since arriving. She filed it away. The vehicles rolled at 1500. The desert spread out in every direction, flat and vast and utterly indifferent, and the horizon to the northeast had already taken on the orange-brown haze that preceded a major sandstorm. The air had changed character, still hot, but pressurized somehow the way air feels when the atmosphere is rearranging itself around a large weather event. Hallie sat in the second vehicle with Torres and Reese. No one talked. The radio carried occasional traffic from the base routine confirmation of the route and timeline. The objective was 40 kilometers out. At the canyon approach point, they would dismount and move on foot approximately 3 kilometers to the objective through the passage. At 30 kilometers out, she could see the Haboob building on the horizon. It was not a metaphor, it was a wall. A dark, churning mass of suspended sand that rose hundreds of meters into the sky and moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of a geological event. It was not moving fast, but it was moving, and it was moving toward the canyon. She did the math again in her head. Depending on speed of approach, the storm would reach the canyon entrance between 17 and 1730. That put Team Viper inside the passage during the worst visibility window. She looked at the back of Blackwood's head in the front vehicle. She had made her argument. She had been clear, she had been professional, and she had been dismissed. What happened next was going to happen, whether she accepted it gracefully or not. The difference was what she chose to do about it. The vehicle stopped at the canyon dismount point at 1550. Everyone was out in under 90 seconds, kit on moving. Blackwood pulled the team into a loose cluster for a final brief 30 seconds. Objectives, confirmed comms check, contingency signals, reviewed. Hallie stood at the edge of the cluster and looked northwest toward the rising elevation of the terrain that led to Hill 350. The summit was visible from here, a dark shape against the orange sky, elevated perhaps 300 meters above the desert floor and approximately 800 meters from where she was standing. Blackwood gave the signal to move. Team Viper began moving northeast into the canyon. Hallie looked at the canyon entrance. She looked at the sky. She looked at Hill 350. She made her decision. She turned northwest and began climbing. No one saw her break formation. That was the first thing she confirmed. Heads down, movement forward. The team had already committed to the canyon, and no one was looking back. The wind had picked up significantly in the last 10 minutes, carrying enough fine grit to sting exposed skin, and Team Viper was moving with the focused momentum of operators who had done this kind of approach enough times that they stopped second-guessing once the decision was made. Blackwood was on point. Kruger was behind him. Torres was third. None of them looked back. Hallie turned northwest and climbed. The terrain going up toward Hill 350 was steep without being technical, loose rock over hard ground, with occasional formations that gave her something solid to push off against. She moved fast. Not reckless fast, but the kind of fast that eats distance without burning reserves you can't afford to spend. She had trained for this specific problem without knowing she was training for it. Every long, uphill movement in poor conditions, every load-bearing climb with a full pack and a rifle, had been building toward exactly this kind of climb on exactly this kind of timeline. She checked her watch as she moved. 15:58. The storm was going to hit the canyon no later than 17:15, based on what she could see developing to the northwest. She had approximately 75 minutes to reach the summit, establish a position, and be ready. The climb itself at her current pace was going to take 40 to 50 minutes. That left her 25 minutes of margin, maybe less depending on what the wind did to her on the upper section. She climbed. Her radio was set to the team frequency, and she could hear the movement check-ins as Team Viper pushed into the canyon passage. They were clean and professional interval calls, position, confirmations, the terse language of people who communicate in minimums, because every unnecessary word is a cognitive load you can't afford. Blackwood's voice was steady. Kruger's responses were immediate. She listened while she climbed and used the sound of their voices to track their progress. At 16:12, Blackwood called the first waypoint. They were approximately 300 meters inside the canyon. Everything clear. She was 200 meters up the hillside and her lungs were working hard. The air was thicker now, the suspended sand reducing visibility to perhaps 400 meters in the direction of the storm. She kept her eyes on the ground directly in front of her and trusted her map memory for what was above. At 16:19, Torres called an interval. Still clean, the team was moving well. She cleared a rock shelf and found the upper slope of Hill 350 opening out ahead of her. The gradient decreased slightly, which let her lengthen her stride. She pushed harder. At 16:24, something changed on the radio. It wasn't dramatic. It was one word from Kruger delivered in a voice that was entirely controlled, but contained a quality she recognized immediately, the particular flatness a trained operator's voice gets when he has seen something that his training is working very hard to manage. "Hold," Kruger said. Movement on the team frequency stopped. She could hear breathing, wind interference on the transmission. Then Blackwood's voice, low and careful. "Report. Movement. Upper ridgeline, north end." A pause. Could be thermal, could be rock shift. Direction. East side of the passage, 40 meters up, maybe more. Hard to read in this light. She was still climbing. Her legs were burning. She did not slow down. Blackwood's voice came back on. "Maintain pace. Eyes up. Callaway, rear security." "Copy." She pressed her watch. 16:26. The summit of Hill 350 was approximately 120 meters above her current position. She could hear the wind increasing. It was not howling yet. It was more like the deep intake of breath before a shout, a pressure change that moved against her body weight and made the next step cost more than the last one. At 16:31, the radio went to static for 4 seconds. When it cleared, Torres was talking. His voice was compressed, controlled, but the speed of his speech had increased. "Captain, North Ridgeline. I have definite movement. Multiple contacts." Static cracked the transmission. She caught fragments. "Setting up," and then mortar base plate, I think, and then Blackwood's voice cutting across everything with a single word. "Accelerate." She was 80 meters from the summit. She stopped listening to the radio and started climbing with everything she had. The problem with 80 meters of steep elevation gain under a full load is that your body has opinions about it, and your body is not always interested in what the situation requires. Her pack was 32 kilograms. Her rifle case was another 7. Her legs had already absorbed 50 minutes of climbing, and the last section was the steepest. She could feel the burn in her quadriceps transitioning from discomfort to the deeper structural warning. That meant she was drawing on reserves that were going to cost her later. She traded the cost. She climbed. At 16:39, she cleared the summit of Hill 350. She did not stop to take in the view. She moved immediately to the best available firing position, a natural depression in the rock that gave her a low profile against the skyline, and she was getting prone before she had fully caught her breath. She opened her rifle case in a practice sequence, assembled the system in under 90 seconds, and brought her scope up. What she saw through the optic made the air leave her body in a way that had nothing to do with the climb. The northern ridge line of the canyon was exactly where she had calculated it would be from this position, and on it, arranged across the flat rock shelf she had identified the night before from the terrain data, were 9 men. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were working. 2 men were on a mortar tube setting up the base plate with the methodical efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the procedure is automatic. 3 men were positioned behind a light machine gun, one of them feeding an ammunition belt, while the other 2 adjusted elevation. 4 men were spread in a security arc across the rear of the position, weapons oriented outward. 9 men, mortar setup, machine gun team, security element, everything she had predicted in the exact position she had predicted at the exact moment Team Viper was walking toward them through the canyon below. She keyed her radio. "Blackwood, this is Thorne. I have visual on 9 hostile contacts, Northern Ridgeline Hill, 350 Summit. Mortar setup in progress. Machine gun crew active. You are walking into a kill zone. Do you copy?" Static. The storm was eating her transmission. "Blackwood, do you copy?" More static. A fragment of Torres's voice, unintelligible. Then nothing. She tried 3 more times. She changed frequency and tried the base frequency. She tried the emergency channel. She got fragments on one transmission, something that might have been Kruger's voice saying something that might have been her name, and then the storm closed around the signal completely, and the radio gave her nothing but white noise. She looked through the scope. The mortar crew was almost set up. She calculated the distance in real time. The scope's ranging system confirmed what she had estimated the night before. 3,040 meters to the center of the enemy position, 3,060 to the mortar setup, 3,020 to the machine gun crew. A span of perhaps 40 meters of lateral spread across the full position. At this distance, with the current wind, a standard shot required a lateral hold of approximately 18 to 22 meters. The bullet flight time at this range was between 3.8 and 4.2 seconds, depending on muzzle velocity consistency across the barrel temperature. During those 4 seconds, the wind could shift. The target could move. The sandstorm turbulence could introduce a variable that no calculation could predict. She had to decide, not whether to shoot. That decision had already been made before she started climbing, when she had packed her kit for Hill 350 while the rest of the team was sleeping. The decision she had to make now was sequencing which target first and how fast. The mortar crew was the primary threat. If they got rounds in the tube, Team Viper was dead. The canyon walls would focus the blast pressure. There was no cover on the floor, and a mortar team that knew the approach route could walk rounds down the passage faster than the team could reverse out of it. She put the mortar base plate operator in the center of her reticle. The wind gusted hard and swung the scope image left. She held with it, breathing through the movement, keeping the reticle on the target by reading the gust pattern rather than fighting it. At 16:43, she pressed the trigger. The shot broke. She immediately cycled the bolt and went back to her scope, tracking the impact zone. At this distance, it took almost 4 seconds to know if she had connected. Those 4 seconds were the longest interval she had ever experienced. She held her breath, not for discipline. She was past the point where breathing affected the shot, but because she was genuinely not breathing. The mortar operator went down. She was already moving to the second target. The surviving mortar crew member did not run. He dropped behind the base plate and looked around him, trying to identify the source. At 3,000 meters in the early edge of a sandstorm, with the sound of her shot absorbed by the wind, he had no reference point. He was looking at the canyon floor. He was looking at the ridge line. He was not looking at Hill 350 because nothing about his training told him to look there. She put him in the reticle. The wind had shifted 3 degrees left from the last shot. She adjusted. She breathed. She pressed. Second shot. 3.9 seconds. He went down. 2 of the 9. The machine gun crew had heard something now, not the shot, but the fall of the second man. One of them was on his feet scanning. The other 2 were repositioning behind the gun, swinging it in the direction of the canyon below, which meant they still didn't know where she was. She engaged the gunner first. He was moving, which meant she had to lead him. Calculate not just the distance in wind correction, but also the lateral displacement of a walking human target across 4 seconds of bullet travel. The calculation was the kind of thing that happened below the level of conscious thought after enough training. Her hands moved to where the calculation said they needed to be. She pressed. Third shot. The gunner stopped moving. The other two members of the machine gun crew finally did what she had hoped they wouldn't. They scattered in opposite directions instead of staying together. That meant two separate solutions, two separate adjustments, and a time gap between them during which the security element was going to start understanding what was happening. She tracked the man moving right. Wind was shifting again, the edge of the haboob arriving at the ridgeline, now the air visibly thickening through the optic. She was already at the edge of what the scope could resolve. In another 10 minutes, this shot would be impossible. She pressed the trigger on her fourth round. The man went down. She swung left for the fifth, the second machine gun crew member, and lost him in a gust of sand that briefly whited out the scope image. She held position. The gust dropped. She found him prone now behind a rock formation, trying to make himself small. Prone targets at 3,000 meters required a different hold. She adjusted. Fifth shot. He did not move after. 5 of 9. 4 minutes elapsed. The storm was arriving. The security element had finally oriented on Hill 350. She could see through the scope that two of them were pointing in her direction. Not with weapons, just pointing, communicating to the others. The information was spreading through the 4 remaining men. They knew where she was. They could not see her well enough to engage at this distance, not in the deteriorating visibility, but they were going to try. She saw 2 of them bring weapons up. Their effective range was 300 meters. She was 3,000 away. Their rounds would not reach her in any controlled way. But they were going to fire anyway because that was what people did when they were afraid and had weapons in their hands. She did not have the luxury of being annoyed by it. She picked the man who appeared to be leading the remaining element, the one the others were orienting on for information, and put him in the reticle. The wind was now gusting to what she estimated at 55 knots. The scope image was swimming. Suspended sand particles were accumulating on the objective lens. She blinked her right eye clear of grit, repositioned her cheek weld, and read the gust. In every storm, there were rhythms. Even haboobs had patterns within the chaos. Brief intervals of relative stillness between gust gaps of 2 to 4 seconds, during which the wind held a more consistent direction before it shifted again. She had been tracking the pattern since arriving on the summit. She waited for the gap. 3 seconds. Wind held. She pressed. 6th shot. The leader went down. The remaining 3 men lost cohesion immediately. She could see it in the scope, the way they stopped moving toward a shared objective and started moving individually. Panic was a predictable thing. She had 2 shots remaining for certain and one that was marginal, given her ammunition load. She picked the man closest to the mortar tube. He was moving toward it, which meant he was trying to complete the mission even without the crew either out of discipline or desperation, and it didn't matter which. 7th shot. He went down 3 meters from the tube. 8. Another of the security element trying to find cover behind the machine gun body. She calculated the angle required to clear the gun frame and adjusted. 8th shot. She heard no confirmation through the scope. The storm had reduced her visual resolution to the point where she was tracking movement more than individual targets. But the movement stopped. 1 man left. She scanned. He was running. Not toward the canyon, not toward the mortar. He was running laterally across the ridgeline, moving away from the position, and she recognized immediately what he was doing. He was the only one who had understood from the beginning that the ground they were standing on was already lost and he was trying to survive. She tracked him. In training, they had discussed the moral weight of this moment. A man running away, a man who has stopped being an immediate threat by virtue of running away from rather than toward. The discussion in training was always abstract, conducted in clean-lit rooms with coffee cups on the tables and no wind in the microphone. The reality was this: if that man reached a radio or a vehicle or any other position with line of sight back to the canyon floor, Team Viper was still in danger. Not from him directly, from what he could communicate. She tracked him for 2 full seconds. She pressed the trigger. 9th shot. The ridgeline was still. She did not celebrate. She did not feel relief, not yet. Relief was a thing you could afford when the team was extracted and accounted for, not before. She immediately went back to scanning the full position, methodically checking for additional movement, for anyone she might have miscounted, for any sign that the position had more personnel than the 9 she had identified. Nothing moved. She rolled onto her side and keyed the radio again. "Blackwood, this is Thorne. Northern ridgeline is clear. 9 hostiles down. Mortar threat neutralized. Machine gun crew eliminated. Do you copy? Static. The storm was complete now. The Haboob had fully arrived and the radio was useless. She tried twice more and got nothing. She rolled back prone and held her position, scanning the canyon below through the optic as the visibility continued to collapse. She caught glimpses through the sand movement on the canyon floor. Team Viper still advancing, still alive, still completely unaware of what had just been removed from their path. Blackwood's voice came through the static in a fragment. She caught the word clear and something that might have been a waypoint call. They were still moving. The mission was still proceeding. They had felt nothing from the ridgeline because there had been nothing to feel, no rounds coming down, no mortar impacts, no machine gun traversing the canyon floor. They had walked through a kill zone that had been disassembled above their heads without their knowledge. She checked her ammunition. She checked her wind calls against the shots she had taken, running the sequence back in her head to identify any errors in her process, any moment where she had made a decision she couldn't justify. She found none. Not because she was perfect, she was not, but because the preparation had been thorough enough that when the moment arrived, the decisions were already made. She had just executed them. The storm howled around her, sand stripped against her exposed skin and equipment. She kept the optic low to protect the objective lens and held position because leaving the summit before she was confident the team had cleared the canyon was not something she was going to do. Somewhere below her in the blind canyon, 8 men were walking toward an objective they were going to reach because she had made a choice that nobody had authorized from a position, nobody had approved at a distance that didn't appear in any official doctrine as achievable under current conditions. She thought about Blackwood's face in the briefing, the patient condescension in his voice, the way Kruger had turned away, Torres asking about her range setup like he was trying to solve a puzzle he wasn't quite sure he wanted to solve. She thought about none of it for long. You didn't get to feel vindicated while the team was still in the field. That was a rule she had made for herself years ago, and she held it. She held position, and she scanned, and she waited for the storm to pass. At 17:22, her radio crackled back to life. The first voice she heard clearly was Torres. He sounded like a man who has just put together pieces of something that should have been obvious sooner and can't quite decide what to do with the understanding. "Captain," Torres said, "I need you to look at the ridgeline." Silence on the frequency. Then Blackwood's voice. "I'm looking." "Those bodies weren't there when we entered the passage," Torres said. A longer silence. "No," Blackwood said. "They weren't." She keyed her radio. "Blackwood, Imoyo. This is Thorne. I am at the summit of Hill 350. The ridgeline has been cleared. 9 hostiles down. All primary threats neutralized before your team reached the objective waypoint. Do you copy?" This time the transmission went through clean. The silence that followed it was a different kind of silence from any she had heard from Team Viper since arriving at FOB Sentinel. It was not the silence of men choosing dismissal. It was the silence of men recalibrating. Blackwood's voice came back on. It was controlled, professional. But underneath the professionalism was something she could hear even through the radio static in the wind. "Copy, Thorne," he said. "We copy." She exhaled slowly and went back to scanning the ridgeline. 9 men, 9 shots, 4 minutes and 21 seconds. In a sandstorm from 3,000 meters alone on a hilltop that nobody had authorized her to climb. The team was alive. The mission was intact. And somewhere down in that canyon, Captain Garrett Blackwood was standing in the middle of his successful approach route, looking up at a ridgeline full of men he had never seen, who had never gotten the chance to kill him, and he was doing the mathematics of what that meant. She let him do the math. She had her own work to finish. The storm did not care about any of it. It kept coming. Hallie held position on the summit of Hill 350, while the Haboob pressed down on everything around her with the indifferent weight of a natural system that had no awareness of the 9 men she had just put on the ground, or the 8 men still moving through the canyon below, or the fact that any of this mattered to anyone. The wind was running at sustained 50 knots now, with gusts that pushed past 60, and the sand was no longer arriving in waves. It was continuous, a single unbroken pressure against every exposed surface. Her optic was barely functional. She was cleaning the objective lens every 90 seconds with the corner of her sleeve and getting perhaps 40% resolution on anything beyond 800 meters. She did it anyway, because the alternative was to stop watching, and she was not ready to stop watching. At 17:31, she picked up movement on the canyon floor that was different from Team Viper's advance. It was too far north, too fast, coming from a lateral direction rather than the established approach corridor. She cleaned the lens and looked again. A vehicle. Or what had been a vehicle. It was hard to resolve through the storm, but the shape was wrong for natural terrain, and it was moving with the purposeful trajectory of something under power rather than the random drift of storm debris. She keyed her radio. Blackwood, I have possible vehicle movement north of your position, lateral approach from the east. Approximately 400 meters north of your current waypoint. Do you copy? Static chewed most of the transmission. She got a broken response, Kruger's voice she thought asking for a repeat, and then the frequency went to white noise again. She watched the vehicle shape. It stopped. She counted 11 seconds of stillness. Then it moved again, slower this time, and the direction had changed. It was now oriented toward the canyon exit rather than the interior. Whoever was driving it had either seen something they didn't like or received a communication that changed their instructions. She thought about the ninth man, the one who had been running laterally across the ridgeline when she put him down. She had dropped him before he reached any obvious communication point, but she had no way of knowing if he had gotten a message out in the seconds before she acquired him. 4 seconds of burst transmission was enough to tell someone at a vehicle that the ambush position had been compromised, which meant the vehicle was not a rescue element for the ambush team. It was a reaction element. Someone had known quickly enough to redirect the vehicle away from an already lost position and toward the canyon exit, which was where Team Viper was going to come out. She was already calculating the distance to the vehicle when it stopped again, and she lost it in a gust that reduced her effective visibility to under 200 meters for approximately 45 seconds. When the gust dropped, the vehicle was gone. Not destroyed, not disabled. Gone, moved in a direction she could no longer track during a visibility gap she couldn't do anything about. She felt the first real spike of cold fear since arriving on the summit. Not for herself, for the team. Blackwood, she transmitted. Vehicle contact lost. Last position approximately 400 meters north of your exit point. Possible reaction element moving toward canyon exit. I say again, possible hostile vehicle at your extraction route. Do you copy? This time the static cleared enough for a full response. Blackwood's voice came through. He sounded like a man who is receiving information that is changing the shape of the problem he thought he was solving and managing that change without letting it become panic. Copy Thorn. We copy the vehicle warning, continuing to objective. What's your status? Summit of hill 350, ridgeline still clear. Radio is degrading with storm. I'm going to lose comms in the next few minutes. Understood. A brief pause. Thorn? Sir? Good work. She did not respond to that. There was nothing to say to it that wasn't either too small or too large for the frequency. She went back to scanning. At 17:44, the radio died completely. Not static, complete silence, the kind that meant the atmospheric interference from the haboob had finally exceeded what the system could push through. She tried 3 frequencies, all silent. She clipped the radio to her kit and accepted the situation for what it was. She was alone on a hilltop in a sandstorm with no communications approximately 40 kilometers from base, with a rifle that had 9 fewer rounds than it had started with, and a team she could no longer see, hear, or reach. She breathed through the calculation of her options. Going down the hill was one option, rejoining the team on the canyon floor. But descending in the current visibility meant losing the elevated position that was her only tactical advantage. And if the reaction vehicle was moving toward the extraction route, she needed line of sight on that route more than she needed to be standing next to people who still weren't entirely sure what she was doing there. She stayed on the summit. At 17:58, she heard gunfire. It came from the north, from the direction of the objective, which meant Team Viper had reached the command post and initiated the assault. She listened to the character of the fire. It was mixed multiple weapons, short controlled bursts from the direction she associated with the team, answered by heavier, less disciplined fire from a fixed position. The assault was meeting resistance. That was expected. The command post was confirmed to have a security detail. What was not expected was the second set of weapons that opened up approximately 90 seconds after the initial contact. This fire was coming from a different direction. Further east. Moving. The reaction vehicle had not been running away. It had been repositioning. She had maybe 45 seconds to process what that meant. Before the math completed itself, the vehicle had come around the eastern edge of the canyon system and was now providing flanking fire on Team Viper's assault position from a direction the team had not prepared for. The command post security was holding the front. The vehicle was hitting the flank. The team was caught between two fires. She was looking at approximately 2,800 meters to the eastern position, shorter than her previous shots, still at the edge of achievable in the current conditions against a moving target she could barely resolve. She did not spend time arguing with herself about it. She moved to the best available angle on the eastern position and went prone. The vehicle was visible as a shape, not a clear target, but a shape approximately 2 kilometers east and 400 meters below her elevation. She could see muzzle flash from the vehicle's mounted weapon system, a heavy machine gun she estimated based on the rate and weight of the fire. There were 2 human shapes near the vehicle, maybe 3. She ranged the clearest muzzle flash signature, 2,780 meters. At this range, with the wind at its current speed and direction, she needed to hold approximately 14 meters left and calculate a drop correction that accounted for the angle difference from a downhill shot versus her previous level-to-level engagement. Downhill shots shortened the effective distance by a function of the angle she was shooting down at approximately 12 degrees, which reduced the ballistic arc just enough to require a lower hold than the raw range suggested. She built the solution in her head, checked it, built it again. The gunfire from the east position was intensifying. She could hear in the pattern of Team Viper's return fire that they were under real pressure. The intervals were shorter, the responses faster, the rhythm of a unit that is managing a problem rather than controlling a situation. She put the muzzle flash in her reticle, held 14 meters left, and adjusted for angle, breathed, and waited for a gust to pass. The gap came at 1806. She pressed. The muzzle flash stopped. She cycled immediately and acquired the second shape near the vehicle. He was moving away from the vehicle, away from the gun, which meant either he had understood what just happened or the gun position had suddenly become untenable for a reason that was obvious to him and not immediately obvious to her. She pressed on the second shape. He stopped moving. 2 shots, 2 contacts. The vehicle's weapon system went silent. The gunfire in the area of the objective continued for another 4 minutes. Then it reduced. Then it stopped. The sudden absence of it was its own kind of loud, the ears filling in the silence with the ghost of what had been there. She scanned the entire sector methodically, starting at the objective and sweeping east, then north, then back to the ridgeline. Nothing moving. The storm was the only thing alive out there. At 1814, a voice came through on the radio that she had assumed was dead. It was weak, chopped by static, but it was Torres, and what he said was clear enough. Objective secured. Viper 6 is down. Repeat, Viper 6 is down. We need extraction. Viper 6, Blackwood. She was moving before she finished processing it, breaking down her rifle and stowing it in a sequence that was automatic enough that her hands did it while her mind was running the extraction math. Blackwood was down. She did not know the severity. Torres's voice had been controlled, but the speed of it told her it was serious enough to call before the objective was fully cleared. She had to get down the hill. The descent was harder than the climb in the storm conditions. The reduced visibility made footing uncertain. The wind was pushing against her lateral movement, and her legs had absorbed enough workload by this point that they were operating on reserves rather than capacity. She moved carefully fast, which was slower than she wanted and faster than was fully safe. She fell once 20 meters below the summit, going over an unseen rock edge and hitting the slope hard on her right side. She was up in 3 seconds. She assessed the damage while moving right hip, bruised or worse, but functional and no structural compromise to her mobility. She adjusted her pack weight and kept going. At 1827, she reached the canyon floor. The team was not at the extraction point, yet they were still coming out of the north end of the passage, and she could hear them before she could see them in the storm. She positioned herself at the canyon exit and waited. Kruger came through first. His face was stripped of everything she had seen there since her arrival. No mockery, no performance, no practiced indifference. He looked like a man who has been in a fight and knows exactly how close the margin was. He saw her and stopped, just for a second. Then he kept moving and said, "Flank position, east side, you take that out." "Yes," she said. He nodded once. It was a very small nod, but it was not the nod of a man conceding a point he's going to revisit later. It was the nod of a man who has updated his understanding of something and is not going to argue with the update. Torres came next, then Reese, then Calloway, and Marsh moving together because they were carrying someone between them. Blackwood. He was conscious she could see his eyes tracking, but his left leg was wrong, the angle of it telling the story before Torres said anything. Took a ricochet off the command post wall, Torres said, coming up beside her. Femur, we think. Maybe the joint. He's losing blood, but it's controlled. How far to the vehicles? She asked. 3 kilometers south. The storm's going to make it. What's our extraction timeline? She cut across. If we can get a radio signal out once we clear the canyon, maybe 40 minutes for a bird. An hour if the storm grounds them. Then we walk 3 kilometers and we get the signal out, she said. What do you need from me? Torres looked at her, really looked at her in the way that people look at someone when they're reconciling 2 different versions of the same person and realizing one of the versions was never accurate. Take point, he said. You know this terrain better than any of us right now. She moved to the front of the element and they started south. The walk through the storm was the hardest physical thing she had done since arriving in the desert, and she had just climbed a mountain under load. The difference was that on the mountain, she had been moving alone and could calibrate entirely to her own capacity. Now she was setting a pace for 7 other people, one of whom was being carried and was losing blood at a controlled but non-zero rate. And the pace had to be fast enough to matter, but slow enough that the men carrying Blackwood didn't drop him. She found the pace inside 30 seconds and held it. Blackwood spoke for the first time at 1841. His voice was strained but deliberate. She was at the front of the element and he was being carried near the middle, so she heard him clearly only because the storm had briefly dropped to a lower register. Thorne, he said. She did not slow down. Sir. Hill 35. Oh, yes, sir. How long were you planning that? Since the briefing, she said. A pause. She could hear the effort in his breathing, not from weakness, from the controlled management of pain. I told you the approach stood as planned, he said. Oh, yeah. You did. And you climbed the hill anyway. I did. Another pause. Longer. She kept walking. The storm pushed against her left side and she leaned into it by instinct. You going to tell me it was the right call? He asked. No, sir. Why not? Because you already know it was, she said, and you don't need me to tell you things you already know. The silence that followed that was not hostile. It was the silence of a man working through something that was going to take more than one conversation to fully process, and she respected his right to take whatever time that required. Kruger appeared at her right shoulder about 50 meters later. He matched her pace without being asked. The vehicle, he said, eastern position. 2 targets. That was what 2 kilometers at 2.7, she said. He absorbed that. In the storm. Wind had dropped slightly by then, still over 40 knots. Kruger walked beside her for about 20 meters without saying anything. Then he said very quietly, when I said what I said yesterday morning at the motor pool. You were honest, she said. I was wrong. You were honest about what you believed, she said. You didn't know yet. I should have looked harder. She glanced at him. His face was forward, watching the terrain through the storm. There was something in his expression that was neither comfortable nor performative. It was the look of a man sitting with something that didn't feel good and refusing to look away from it. You're looking now, she said. He didn't answer that, but she saw his jaw set and she thought that was probably all the answer either of them needed from the moment. At 1853, they cleared the southern edge of the canyon system and Torres got a partial radio signal on the extraction frequency. Partial was enough. He talked fast and clear, gave their position and Blackwood's status, and got a confirmation that an extraction bird was being prepped and would be wheels up within 20 minutes pending storm assessment. 20 minutes. She could hold the element together for 20 minutes. She set Blackwood down in the most sheltered position available, the lee side of a rock formation that broke the direct wind load and went through his injury with the team's medical kit, while Torres maintained the radio contact. The femur was fractured. She confirmed the blood control that Calloway had applied in the canyon was holding. His pulse was strong and his color was acceptable, given the blood loss. He was going to need surgery, but he was going to be fine. He looked at her while she worked. She could feel the weight of his attention, not uncomfortable, not hostile, just there. the focused attention of a man who is taking inventory of what he previously dismissed. You calculated the shots before you climbed, he said. It wasn't a question. The night before, she said, I ran the ballistics for 3,000 meters in Haboob wind conditions from the hill 350 summit to the northern ridgeline. That range isn't in any current doctrine. No, sir. Why did you believe you could make it? She finished the check on his bandaging and sat back on her heels. She looked at him directly the way she had looked at him in the briefing room when he told her the approach stood as planned. Because I ran the numbers, she said. And the numbers said it was possible. Not easy. Not guaranteed. Possible. I've spent 6 years building toward that shot without knowing that was what I was building toward. She paused. If I'd told you that in the briefing, would it have changed anything? Blackwood held her gaze. His face was honest in the way that pain makes people honest. The performance layer stripped away just the actual man underneath. Probably not, he said. Then it didn't matter what I knew, she said. It only mattered what I did. Reese, who was standing behind her running a sector scan, made a sound. Not a word, just a sound the kind a person makes when something lands that they weren't expecting to land. Torres looked up from the radio. He had the kind of face that processed things slowly but completely, and she could see he was processing this one. He went back to the radio without commenting, but the way he held himself had changed slightly. Something in the shoulders. Something that wasn't the same posture he'd had since a Phobe Sentinel. At 1908, the extraction bird confirmed final approach. The storm was still running, but had dropped to a level that military aviation could navigate. She could hear the rotors at 1911, not see them, but hear them, the distinctive percussion cutting through the wind. It was before the aircraft resolved out of the sand haze at approximately 200 meters. They loaded Blackwood first. He gripped the edge of the aircraft frame as they lifted him in, and before he was fully inside, he turned his head and found her standing below. She was the smallest person at the extraction point. She had been the smallest person at every point for her entire career, and she was used to that, meaning she was the last thing people looked at. He was looking at her. She held his gaze. She did not offer anything. No salute, no acknowledgement, no performance. She just held his gaze the way she held everything steady and without need. He broke contact first. The aircraft crew finished loading him. The rest of the team boarded in order. Torres was the last one up. He stopped at the aircraft door and looked back at her. The storm was tearing at everything: his kit, his hair under the helmet edge, the fabric of the uniform. He looked like a man standing in a bad dream who has just figured out it was real all along. You knew, he said, at the motor pool, when I asked about your range setup, you already knew what you were going to do. I had a plan, she said. You walked into this knowing they weren't going to listen to you. I walked into this knowing what the terrain required, she said. Whether anyone listened was secondary. Torres looked at her for another 3 seconds. The wind howled between them. Then he said, "Get on the aircraft, Thorne." She picked up her rifle case and climbed aboard. The aircraft lifted at 1914. She sat against the interior wall with her rifle across her knees and her eyes forward. Across from her, Blackwood was laid out with a medical kit working on his leg. His eyes closed, his breathing controlled. Kruger was 2 seats down, staring at nothing. Reese and Calloway and Marsh were the particular quiet of men who have been in a real fight and are sitting inside the aftermath of it. Torres sat directly across from her. He watched her for the first 30 seconds of the flight. Then he said very quietly, just loud enough for her to hear over the aircraft noise, "I should have listened when you brought up the canyon approach." She looked at him. "You weren't in a position to change the decision. I could have pushed harder. Would it have mattered?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "No," he said. "Probably not." "Then you did what you could with what you had," she said. "Same as me." He nodded, slow, settled, like a man accepting the weight of something rather than putting it down. She looked out the small window at the storm below the Haboob, spreading across the desert in every direction, brown and enormous, and completely unconcerned with the mathematics of what had just occurred inside it. 9 men on a ridgeline, 2 more at a vehicle, 11 shots total, a team of 8 alive because she had climbed a hill nobody told her to climb and made calculations that nobody believed were achievable. The aircraft climbed above the worst of the storm layer, and for a moment the air cleared and she could see the desert spread out below in the last light of the day, vast and flat and stripped of every detail that made it feel personal. She felt the pain in her right hip for the first time since the fall. She had been moving fast enough and working hard enough that the body had been suppressing it. Now, in stillness, it arrived. She did not react to it outwardly. She breathed through it and adjusted her position by 2 degrees and let the aircraft carry her back toward a base where 24 hours ago, men had laughed at her for being 4 feet 9 inches tall. She thought about what was going to happen when they landed. The debrief, the questions, the formal accounting of unauthorized position, unsanctioned engagement, shots fired outside the mission parameters, fire discipline exceptions, rules of engagement, compliance review. She was prepared for all of it. She had been prepared for all of it since before she packed her kit. What she had not been prepared for what she was sitting with now in the aircraft noise and the pain and the particular exhaustion that follows maximum effort was the look on Blackwood's face when he had said her name from the extraction point. Not the look of a commander assessing an asset, the look of a person seeing another person, fully, without the filter of what he had decided she was before she had a chance to show him anything different. She had not expected that to mean as much as it did. She looked at her hands resting on the rifle case. Steady. The same hands that had held the trigger on a storm-blurred target 3,000 meters away and found stillness in the chaos because the preparation had been real and the calculation had been honest and the decision had been made long before the moment required it. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, just to be still for the first time since she had turned northwest at the canyon entrance and started climbing. The aircraft carried them home through the dying storm. They landed at FOB Sentinel at 1947. The storm had dropped to a trailing edge by the time the aircraft touched down, still blowing, still pushing sand against every surface. But the worst of it had passed north and the base was operational again. Ground crew was waiting with a stretcher for Blackwood. Medical was standing by. The debrief team was visible near the ops building. 2 officers with tablets, in the particular posture of people who have been waiting with the questions they consider urgent. Hallie was the last one off the aircraft. She stepped down onto the tarmac, and her right hip told her immediately that the fall on the descent had done more than bruise. She absorbed the pain, adjusted her weight distribution, and kept her face neutral. There would be time for a medical assessment after the debrief. She was not going to walk off an aircraft limping in front of everyone who had spent the previous 30 hours deciding she was decorative. Blackwood was already on the stretcher, already moving toward the medical bay, but he turned his head as they carried him past her and said 2 words, not loud, not for the debrief team or the ground crew or anyone else. "Well done," he said. She did not look after him when they carried him away. She picked up her rifle case and walked toward the ops building. The debrief started at 2015. The room was a standard after-action configuration long table overhead light, 2 officers from the operational command element she had not previously met, and a recording system running in the corner. Torres was present. Kruger was present. The rest of Team Viper was either in medical for minor treatment or had been cleared and dismissed to quarters. Hallie sat at the end of the table with her kit beside her chair and her rifle case on the floor by her right foot. The senior officer, a lieutenant colonel named Haskell, opened the session without preamble. "Specialist Thorne," he said, "at approximately 1550 hours, you broke formation from the primary mission element and moved independently to an unsanctioned position at the summit of Hill 350. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," she said. "You did this without authorization from the element commander." Captain Blackwood's plan did not include the Hill 350 position. "I made an independent decision to occupy it." An independent decision. Haskell looked at the tablet in his hand. "You then engaged 11 enemy combatants across 2 separate contact events at ranges between 2,700 and 3,060 meters during a Haboob event with wind speeds exceeding 50 knots. Is that a fair characterization?" "Yes, sir." Haskell set the tablet down. He looked at her with the careful expression of a man who has been in the military long enough to know that the rules exist for reasons, and that the reasons sometimes produce outcomes that the rules weren't designed to handle. "Walk me through the decision to break formation," he said. She walked him through it, methodically, without embellishment, without apology. The terrain assessment, the weather analysis, the intelligence pattern she had identified from the 3 prior attacks, the canyon vulnerability, the proposed alternative that had been dismissed in the briefing, the decision to prepare the hill. 350 Kit regardless the moment at the canyon entrance when she turned northwest instead of northeast. Kruger, sitting 2 seats down, did not move during any of it. Torres was watching her with an attention that had no performance in it, just a man listening to a full accounting of something he had been present for but had not fully seen. "You made a unilateral decision to operate outside your assigned position," Haskell said when she finished. "Yes, sir." "You understand that constitutes a breach of mission protocol?" "Yes, sir." "And you're not disputing that?" "No, sir." Haskell looked at her for a long moment. "Is there anything you want to add to the record before we continue?" She considered it, not the question. She had been considering this since the aircraft, since the moment she had closed her eyes and sat in the noise. What she said now was going to shape not just her own future, but the formal record of what had happened out there. She had one chance to put it in the right frame. The 9 contacts on the northern ridgeline had a complete mortar setup and a light machine gun in position, she said. They were staged at the only ridgeline position that provided effective coverage of the full canyon passage. Team Viper would have entered the kill zone at approximately 1710 during peak storm conditions, with air support unavailable and comms degraded. The reaction vehicle that engaged the team from the east at approximately 1806 was a secondary element. Combined, those threats represented a coordinated ambush that would have killed or critically wounded the majority of the Viper element before they reached the objective. She paused. The mission succeeded. The team came home. I understand that I broke protocol to make that happen, and I accept whatever determination this debrief produces. But the record should reflect what the alternative was. The room was quiet. Haskell looked at Torres. Torres looked back at him and gave a single nod, small, unambiguous. Haskell wrote something on his tablet. Then he looked back at Hallie. "The record will reflect everything," he said, "including what you just said." The debrief continued for another hour. She answered every question with the same precision she had brought to the shots, clean, complete, no gaps. When they got to the ballistics of the long-range engagements, the second officer, a major named Price, stopped her twice to ask her to repeat the numbers. Not because he didn't believe them, because he was confirming them against whatever reference he had in front of him, and the confirmation kept coming back with the same answer. Torres spoke once during the debrief unprompted. He said, "I want the record to show that Specialist Thorne's assessment of the canyon vulnerability was presented in full during the mission briefing and dismissed by command authority. That is not a criticism of Captain Blackwood's decision. It is a contextual fact that matters for the record." Haskell looked at him. Noted. The debrief closed at 2140. Haskell told her the formal determination would be issued within 72 hours, and that she was confined to base pending that outcome. She acknowledged. She picked up her rifle case and walked to medical. The hip was worse than she had let herself believe during the debrief. The medical officer, a no-nonsense captain named Wren, ran her hands along the injury with practiced efficiency and announced a severe contusion with a possible hairline fracture of the iliac crest. Rest anti-inflammatories reassessment in 24 hours. She was given a room in the medical bay. She lay on the cot in the medical bay at 2210 and looked at the ceiling. Her body was registering everything it had absorbed over the previous 30 hours, the sleepless night of preparation, the climb, the shooting, the descent, the walk to extraction. It was all arriving at once now that there was no immediate demand suppressing it. Her legs ached from the bone out. Her right hand had a tremor she was aware of only because she was checking for it. Post-adrenaline response normal would resolve in 8 to 12 hours. Her hip was a steady, deep pulse of pain that the medication had reduced but not eliminated. She was alive. The team was alive. Blackwood was in surgery one bay over, and the last status she had heard was that the femur repair was going well, and he was expected to have full function in 8 to 10 months. She thought about all of it for approximately 4 minutes. Then she fell asleep. She woke at 0314 because someone had knocked on the door of the medical bay. Not hard, a quiet knock, the kind that is checking whether you're awake rather than demanding entry. She said, "Come in." Kruger opened the door. He was in a base uniform, not kit. Someone who had gone to quarters, tried to sleep, failed, and eventually ended up walking somewhere. He had coffee in one hand. He was not holding the other hand in any particular way, which she had come to recognize as his version of being uncertain what to do with himself. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You awake enough to talk?" "Yes," she said. He came in and sat in the chair beside the cot. He put the coffee on the small table beside it, and then he put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a few seconds. She waited. Kruger was a man who got to the point eventually, but he needed to circle it first, and interrupting the circle just made it wider. "I've been running the numbers," he said finally. "On the canyon. What would have happened if you hadn't gone to the hill?" "Don't," she said. He looked up at her. "Don't run those numbers," she said. "It didn't happen that way. Running the other version doesn't change anything, and it'll just sit in your head." He looked at her steadily. "You ever run the other version? After something like this?" "I run it once," she said, "to make sure I understand what the margin was. Then I stop." "And you've stopped." "I stopped on the aircraft." He absorbed that. "You knew going up that hill what the odds were on those shots." "I knew what the math said," she said. "The math said possible. It didn't say guaranteed. And if the shots had missed, then Team Viper would have had warning from the sound of my fire and at least a partial indication of the ridge position," she said. "It wasn't a zero outcome situation if I missed. It was a worse situation, but not zero." Kruger was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a very cold way to think about it." "Yes," she said, "it is." He looked at her with something she had not seen from him before, not respect, exactly more like recognition. The look of a man who has met a version of a thing he thought he already understood and discovered it was more complex than his understanding. "In the bay," he said, "when you first arrived, I said, 'I know what you said,'" she told him. "I want to say it was just standard team hazing, but it wasn't." He paused. "We looked at you and made a decision about what you were before you opened your mouth. That's not something I'm proud of." She looked at him directly. "Did it affect your performance in the canyon?" she asked. "No." "Did it affect Torres's?" "No." "Then the mission succeeded," she said. "What you think of me personally doesn't determine mission outcomes. What I can do does. I knew what I was walking into when I arrived here. I didn't need you to believe in me. I needed you to stay out of my way long enough for me to do my job." Kruger let that sit. He picked up the coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. "You're not going to let me apologize," he said. "You can apologize if you need to," she said. "I'm just telling you it's not required for my benefit." He looked at her for a long moment, then quietly, with the particular honesty that 3 in the morning produces in people, 3,000 meters thorn. In a haboob, 9 shots. "Yes," she said. "I didn't know that was possible. Most people don't. You did." "I knew the math said it was possible," she repeated. "Knowing and doing are 2 different problems." He nodded. He stood up. He picked up the coffee and held it for a moment like he was trying to figure out if he'd said what he came to say. Then he set the coffee back on the table beside her cot. "Get some sleep," he said. "Haskell's going to have a full team session in the morning." He left. She picked up the coffee, drank half of it, and lay back on the cot. The session Kruger had mentioned happened at 0900. All of Team Viper was present. Blackwood was not still in recovery from surgery, but his presence was communicated through Torres, who had clearly spoken with him before the session. Haskell ran it. It was not a debrief. It was an after-action review, which was a different animal, less about establishing the formal record and more about what the team was going to carry forward. Haskell opened it by putting the ballistic data on the table. The confirmed engagement distances, the confirmed wind speeds from the Haboob data recorder at the base weather station, the confirmed enemy force composition from the post-mission assessment of the ridgeline. He let the numbers sit there for about 15 seconds without saying anything. Then he said, "There is no current doctrine that accounts for confirmed kills at 3,000 meters in these atmospheric conditions. As of this action, there is a reason to write one." Torres said, "She identified the ambush setup from terrain analysis 20 hours before it happened." "Yes," Haskell said. "Her assessment was dismissed in briefing," Torres continued. "Yes." Haskell did not try to soften that. Reese, who had said almost nothing since the extraction, said from the far end of the table, "I want to know why. I want to know why we dismissed it, because she was right, and we need to be honest about why we didn't listen." The room was quiet. Hallie, sitting midway down the table, said nothing. This was not her moment to speak. This was the team processing something internal, and her inserting herself into that process would have been the wrong move regardless of what she was entitled to say. Kruger said it. flatly without drama, because of how she looks, because of her says, because she didn't match the picture we had in our heads of what an operator looks like. We didn't evaluate her tactically because we had already evaluated her visually and decided the visual told us everything we needed to know. He paused. It didn't. The silence that followed was the most substantive thing that had been said in any room Hallie had been in since arriving at FOB Sentinel. Calloway quietly, I laughed. In the bay when she first arrived. When Blackwood made the remark, I laughed. Nobody told him he didn't need to say that. Nobody redirected the conversation. They let it land where it was supposed to land. At 10:23, Haskell received a communication that changed the session's direction entirely. He looked at his tablet, read something, and then looked up at the room with the expression of a man who has just received information that significantly reshapes the frame. Command has completed a preliminary review of the mission record, he said. Based on the documented threat assessment, the enemy force positioning, and the post-mission terrain analysis, they are characterizing Specialist Thorne's independent action as operationally decisive. They are not pursuing a protocol breach determination. He paused. They are pursuing a citation. The room shifted. Not dramatically, these were not men who expressed things dramatically. But the quality of the air changed the way it changes when a weight that everyone has been aware of is quietly removed. Hallie did not react visibly. She had told herself on the aircraft that she was prepared for whatever the debrief produced. She had meant it both ways, prepared for consequences, prepared for clearance. Either outcome had been something she could absorb. She absorbed this one with the same steadiness she had brought to everything else. Torres looked at her from across the table. He said very simply, good. Reese said it too. Then Calloway. Then Marsh. Just the word each of them like they were signing their names to something. Kruger said nothing, but he met her eyes across the table and held them for a full 3 seconds, and what she saw in his face was the complete absence of everything that had been there when she arrived. No performance, no armor, just a man clear-eyed looking at another person he had underestimated and being honest about it without looking away. She looked back at him the same way. At 11:05, she was cleared to leave the session. She walked back to the medical bay, picked up her kit, and went to her bunk room. The converted storage space with the cot and the locker and the window overlooking the motor pool. She sat on the cot and set her rifle case on the floor and looked at the window. The storm had fully passed. The desert outside was still the way. Desert is still, after a major weather event, cleaned and quiet and absolutely indifferent to whatever had occurred during the disruption. The ridgeline on the far edge of the base perimeter was sharp in the morning light. Clear. Definite. She thought about the morning before the mission. Sitting on the far side of the motor pool in the dark, running her breathing cycle, and Kruger coming around the corner with his coffee and watching her with an expression that was starting to crack, but hadn't fully broken yet. She thought about the canyon entrance, the 3 seconds she had stood there looking at the canyon, then at the sky, then at Hill 3. Oh. The decision that was already made before she consciously registered making it. She thought about 9 targets, 11 shots, 1 fall, 1 radio that died at the worst possible moment, and a team that was alive because she had turned northwest when everyone else turned northeast. There was a knock at the door. Come in, she said. It was Torres. He came in and stood near the door in the way that men stand when they have something specific to say and are going to say it without making a production of it. Blackwood wants to see you, he said. When you are ready, medical bay. Is he cleared for visitors? He was asking for you before he was fully out of recovery, Torres said. I'd call that cleared enough. She stood up. Her hip protested but functioned. She picked up nothing, no kit, no rifle, just herself, and followed Torres out of the bunk room toward the medical bay. They walked through the base, and something was different. She noticed it before she could name it, the quality of the attention from the people they passed. Not the dismissive glances of the previous day, not the ostentatious non-looking of people who have decided you are not worth their attention. Something else. A groundswell specialist at the vehicle line turned to watch her pass. 2 operators near the comms building, people she had never spoken to, nodded when she came by. Word had moved through the base, the way word always moved through military installations. Fast, detailed, slightly distorted at the edges, but accurate at the center. She had taken 9 shots at 3,000 meters in a haboob and kept a SEAL team alive. People knew. She did not change her pace or her expression. She walked the same way she always walked. Torres held the medical bay door for her. She went in. Blackwood was in the second bed on the right. His left leg was immobilized and elevated. He was pale from surgery and blood loss, but his eyes were sharp and his face was present in the way that mattered. He was not someone managing sedation. He was someone who had been waiting. She pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down. Torres stayed by the door. Blackwood looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. She let him take the time. There were things that needed more than a moment to find the right words for, and she had learned a long time ago that patience in those spaces was usually the most useful thing you could offer. Finally, he said, "I underestimated you." "Yes, sir," she said. "I want you to know I'm not saying that as a formality." "I know," she said. "I looked at you and I made a judgment that had nothing to do with your record, your training, or anything you said in that briefing. I made it before you opened your mouth. That cost us, or it almost did. It almost cost us everything." He held her gaze without flinching from it. "You're the reason we're having this conversation instead of a very different one." She did not argue with him. She did not deflect. She held the weight of what he was saying with the same steadiness she brought to everything. "You would have run those numbers eventually," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Not in time." "No," she acknowledged. "Not in time." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "The citation that command is pursuing, I want you to know I'm supporting it fully. What you did on that hill, the preparation, the calculation, the execution, that's not something that gets covered with standard commendation framework. I'm going to say so explicitly." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me for that," he said quietly. "I owe you a great deal more than a written statement." She looked at him, at the honest exhaustion in his face, at the man underneath the rank and the institutional certainty that had defined him when she arrived. He was still a good commander. He was still someone who had run 17 successful canyon approaches and built a team that functioned under extreme conditions. None of that had changed. What had changed was simpler and more significant than any of it. He had looked at her, finally completely without the filter of what he had decided she was supposed to be. She stood up from the chair. "Rest," she said. 8 to 10 months is a long recovery, and you're going to need every day of it." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The closest thing to one she had seen from him. "Specialist Thorne," he said. She paused. "When I'm back on the line," he said, "I want you on my element." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her chair, set it back where she had found it, and walked to the door. She stopped at the threshold and looked back at him. "I'll think about it, sir," she said, and she walked out. Torres fell into step beside her in the corridor. He said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which she was grateful for. Then very quietly he said, "Did you just tell a SEAL team captain you'd think about it?" "I did," she said. Torres made the sound that was not quite a laugh, but was clearly related to one. They walked back through the base in the morning light, and Hallie carried herself exactly the way she had carried herself when she arrived. Same pace, same posture, same contained and directed forward attention. 4 feet 9 inches, the same as she had always been, the same as she was always going to be. The desert was quiet. The storm was over. And somewhere on the northern ridgeline of a canyon 40 kilometers northeast, 9 men were exactly where she had left them, under a sky that was clean and blue and absolute. Torres was still walking beside her when Kruger caught up to them near the vehicle line. He was moving with purpose, not quite running the way a large man moves when he wants to cover ground fast without making it look urgent. He fell into step on Hallie's left without asking permission, and the 3 of them walked together for a moment before he said anything. "Haskell wants a full element assembly at 1300, Kruger said. "Formal, dress uniform." Torres looked at him. "Today." "Command pushed it through this morning, before the citation paperwork even clears, apparently." Hallie kept walking. Her hip was a steady presence she was managing rather than accommodating, and the morning light was sharp enough to make the far ridgeline look close enough to touch. "What kind of formal?" Torres asked. "The kind where people stand at attention and things get set on the record," Kruger said. He looked at Hallie without looking at her directly, the sideways attention of a man who is checking something without wanting to make it obvious he's checking. "You should know before you walk in there that word has moved up the chain faster than it normally does. The colonel at regional command made 3 calls this morning. Two of them were about you. She said nothing. I'm not saying that to pressure you, he said. I'm saying it because you've been walking through this base without any idea of what the temperature is behind you, and I think you should know. She looked at him then. What's the temperature? Hot, he said, simply, without performance. She absorbed that the same way she absorbed everything. Filed it, moved on. 1300, she said. I'll be there. She went back to the medical bay at 11:15, not because the hip required it, but because the medical officer had asked for a follow-up assessment, and Hallie Thorne did not skip medical assessments. Wren ran the same examination she had the night before, added a brief imaging review, and confirmed the hairline fracture, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who delivers bad news and good news at the same speed, because the facts don't change based on how they're packaged. You climbed an 800 meters of steep elevation gain on this, Wren said, pressing two fingers precisely to the injury site. Hallie did not react to the pressure. Yes. And then descended in storm conditions. Yes. And walked 3 kilometers to extraction. Approximately, yes. Wren looked at her. The look was not admiration and it was not disapproval. It was the look of a medical professional who is integrating information that does not fit neatly into standard patient categories. Restricted activity for 2 weeks minimum, Wren said. No load-bearing movement, no elevated terrain, no. I understand, Hallie said. I'm going to need you to actually mean that. I mean it. Wren wrote the restriction into the system and handed her a formal copy. I'm going to put something in the record, she said, something that isn't standard protocol. I'm going to note that you completed an operationally critical action on a fractured pelvis without reporting the injury which affected your performance assessment window. Hallie looked at her. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, Wren said. You didn't have to climb the hill either. She left the medical bay at 12:22 with 40 minutes before the assembly. She went to her bunk room and changed into her dress uniform. She had packed it the same way she packed everything in the correct configuration, stored properly maintained, regardless of whether she expected to need it. She had learned that lesson early. You packed for every possibility, or you packed for the ones you expected, and the ones you expected were never the ones that arrived. She was at the assembly point at 12:58. The full element was already present. Viper team minus Blackwood Haskell and 2 other officers she didn't know. A sergeant major from the regional command who had evidently arrived while she was at medical, and a cluster of base personnel who had found reasons to be near the assembly area at an inconvenient hour. She counted 31 people. For a forward operating base at this size, that was effectively everyone who wasn't on active post or medical. She took her position without ceremony. Kruger was 3 people to her right. He was standing straight in the way that career military men stand straight, not stiff, not performed, just correctly, aligning because alignment was the default setting after enough years. He glanced at her once when she arrived, gave her the smallest possible nod. She returned it. Torres was behind her. She could feel his attention at her back, not uncomfortable, not intrusive. The attention of someone who has decided you matter and is paying the kind of attention that reflects that decision. Haskell ran the assembly. He was precise and brief, which she appreciated. He covered the mission summary in 3 sentences, the enemy force assessment in 2, and then he looked up from his tablet and said, the action taken by Specialist Hallie Thorne on the 14th at Hill 350 represents a level of individual tactical decision-making and weapons execution that this command has rarely documented. I want to be specific about what occurred because the numbers matter. He read them. The distances, the wind speeds confirmed by the base weather station, the bullet flight times calculated from the documented muzzle velocity and range data, the sequential target engagement timeline, 11 shots, 11 confirmed contacts across 2 separate engagement events. The mortar crew neutralized before a single round was delivered. The flanking vehicle neutralized before the team took a second casualty. He read all of it at the same pace with the same flat official voice, and the effect of that flatness was that the numbers landed harder than any dramatization would have allowed, because they were simply real. They didn't need help. When he finished reading, the assembly was quiet in the way that people go quiet when they have heard something that doesn't have an immediate response category. Then Haskell said, Specialist Thorne acted outside authorized mission parameters. She will receive no negative notation for that action. The record will reflect that her judgment, preparation, and execution saved this element from a coordinated ambush that would have resulted in catastrophic casualties. He looked up from the tablet and looked directly at her. The record will also reflect that her tactical assessment presented in the mission briefing and not acted upon was correct in every material detail. That last sentence was the one that changed the air, because it wasn't just about what she had done on the hill. It was about what had happened before in the briefing room and at the table when Blackwood had told her the approach stood as planned and she had said, "Yes, sir," and everyone in that room had watched it happen. Reese, somewhere in the formation, made a sound. Not words, just a sound, the involuntary kind. Haskell proceeded to the citation. He read the formal language, the military phrasing that translated human action into institutional recognition, and then he stepped forward and presented the document. She received it correctly as trained. She looked at it for exactly the appropriate amount of time before coming back to attention. She was not going to cry. She did not make that kind of decision actively. It was not suppression, so much as the simple fact that what she was feeling was too complete and too deep to arrive as tears. It was more like the feeling she had on the aircraft after the last shot, sitting in the noise with her hands on the rifle case. Something settled, something that had been waiting a very long time to be put in the right place. After the formal elements concluded, the assembly broke. The sergeant major from regional command shook her hand and said something about her records being reviewed at a level she had not previously been considered for. She acknowledged that correctly and moved on without lingering on it. Lingering on good news was as dangerous as dwelling on bad. Both kept you from seeing clearly. At 1347, Calloway found her near the equipment building. He was one of the Viper team members she had spoken to, least a quiet man efficient in his work, who had participated in the mockery on her arrival in the way that people participate in group behavior without being its engine. He stopped in front of her, and he looked like someone who had been composing a sentence for several hours and was not entirely sure the composition was finished. "When you arrived," he said, "in the staging bay, I was one of the ones laughing." "I know," she said. "I want to apologize for that." She looked at him directly. He was holding her gaze, and the effort of it was visible, not because he was weak, but because real accountability was effortful for everyone. And the fact that it was effortful made it mean something. "Accepted," she said. He exhaled. Not dramatically. Just the exhale of a man who has said what he needed to say and is now standing on the other side of it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "When you were up there, on the hill, alone in the storm, no comms, 9 targets at 3,000 meters. He paused. "Were you scared?" She considered the question honestly. She gave most questions the same treatment, not performing the consideration, actually performing it. "Not the way you mean," she said finally. "I wasn't afraid of what I had to do. I was afraid of not doing it well enough. Those are two different kinds of afraid." Calloway absorbed that. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that makes sense." He paused. "How did you manage it? The math, the wind, the visibility. How did you keep all of it together when everything was working against you?" "I didn't keep it together," she said. "I prepared well enough that the pieces stayed together on their own. There's a difference. In the moment, I wasn't doing mathematics. The mathematics was already done. I was just executing what the preparation had built." She looked at him. "The work happens before the moment. Always. If you're still figuring things out when the moment arrives, you're already behind." Calloway was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "I'm going to think about that for a long time." "Good," she said. He walked away. She stood for a moment in the light outside the equipment building and breathed through the hip, which was tightening as the anti-inflammatory medication cycled through. 2 weeks restricted activity. She calculated what that meant for her return schedule, her next assignment rotation, the administrative paperwork that would accompany the citation, and the command review the sergeant major had mentioned. A great deal of work was coming. She was not bothered by that. Work was preferable to the alternative, which was time that didn't have structure. Unstructured time was when the other version of events played the one Kruger had wanted to run through the night before. The version where she had missed the first shot, or where the storm had arrived 7 minutes earlier and closed the engagement window entirely, or where the reaction vehicle had been faster than it was. She ran that version once now, standing in the morning light. She ran it through from the beginning. Her turn northwest at the canyon entrance, the climb, the summit, the optic image showing 9 men on the ridgeline who were already set up and operational. She let the version play where the first shot had drifted right in a gust, and the mortar crew had completed their setup and walked rounds down the canyon floor, and the radio was already dead, and nobody on the canyon floor had known it was coming. She ran it through to its conclusion. Then she stopped running it. That was not what had happened. What had happened was what happened, and the version that didn't occur had no claim on the present. She had learned that discipline the same way she had learned every other discipline, not naturally, not without muscle, but through enough repetition that it had become structural rather than effortful. At 15:03, Torres came to find her at the bunk room. He knocked, she said, "Come in." He opened the door and leaned against the frame in the way he had started doing, not coming fully in, which she recognized as his version of respecting her space but not standing in the corridor either, which was his version of making himself available. "Blackwood's asking for you again," he said. "Second time today," she said. "He's got something specific this time, not the general conversation from this morning." She closed the tablet she had been reviewing and stood. The hip, she managed it. "Lead the way." Blackwood looked better than he had that morning. Color returning the acute post-surgical pallor, giving way to something closer to his actual complexion. His leg was still immobilized, but he had shifted himself upright in the bed with the stubborn determination of a man who conducts conversations vertically whenever possible. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Torres positioned himself at the door again. Blackwood said, without preface, "I've been talking to Colonel Rains at Regional Command. The command review the sergeant major mentioned this morning, it's not routine." She waited. "They're building a program," he said, "long-range precision engagement under degraded conditions. Real degraded conditions, not the range approximations currently used for qualification. Storm conditions, communications blackout, independent operation, extended range, beyond current doctrine limits." He looked at her steadily. "They want you to help design the assessment criteria." She looked at him. "They want me to design the test." "They want someone who has actually done what the test is supposed to measure," he said. "That list is currently very short." "How short?" "One person," he said. The room was quiet. Torres was watching the floor. Blackwood was watching her with the focused attention of someone who has thought carefully about what they're about to say and is committed to saying it without dressing it up. "I want to be honest with you," Blackwood said. "Yesterday morning, I would not have thought to recommend you for something like this. I would have looked at your file, seen your qualification scores, noted the record, and then made a decision based on a set of assumptions that had nothing to do with your file or your scores." He paused. "I want you to know that I'm aware of that, not as an apology. I've already apologized, as a statement of fact that I think you deserve to have said clearly." "Why does it matter whether I have it clearly?" she asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because you walked into this base knowing exactly what was going to happen," he said. "You knew we were going to dismiss you before you said a word. You knew the briefing wasn't going to go your way. You prepared for the hill while we were sleeping, and you climbed it without authorization, and you made those shots in a storm, and all of it, every piece of it happened because you had decided before you arrived that what you could do mattered more than what we thought about what you could do." He looked at her with an expression that had no performance left in it whatsoever. "I want you to know that I see that. All of it, not just the shots." She held his gaze for a long moment. "The program," she said. "What's the timeline?" Blackwood exhaled. The particular exhale of a man who has been holding something and is finally permitted to put it down. 60 days for initial framework, curriculum development over the following 4 months. First cohort in 8 months pending funding approval and facility allocation. We're up to Southwest Training Corridor. Similar terrain to what you just operated in. Who else is involved? "That's partially your call," he said. "Rains wants you to have input on the advisory team." She thought about that, the implications of it, the scope, the reach beyond a single mission or a single element. She thought about every sniper school candidate who had sat in front of an instructor who told them the range assessment was the ceiling rather than the floor. She thought about every person who had walked into a room and been evaluated before they opened their mouth on the basis of a picture that the room had already decided was complete. "I'll need the full mission data from the last 72 hours, she said. "The weather station records the ballistic confirmation numbers, the enemy force assessment from the ridge site, all of it." "Done," Blackwood said. "And I'll need 2 weeks," she said. For the hip, he said, not a question. He had clearly already been briefed by someone, Torres or Wren or both. For the hip, she confirmed. He nodded. Then carefully, the program is going to carry your name. Not formally, it'll have a designation number and an institutional title. But informally, in the way these things move through the community, it will be known by what it came from. He paused. A 29-year-old specialist at 4 feet 9 inches who hit 9 targets at 3,000 meters in a haboob and then walked 3 kilometers to extraction on a fractured pelvis. She said nothing. Is that something you're prepared for, he asked. She thought about it honestly. The attention, the weight of being the story rather than the soldier. The way that stories simplified people compressed them into the most dramatic version of a single moment and held them there indefinitely. She had spent her entire career working against that compression. She was not sure she was ready to become its subject. Then she thought about the candidate who didn't exist yet. The person currently somewhere in a training pipeline being told implicitly or explicitly that the assessment criteria were built for a specific kind of operator, and that criteria was not them. The person who was going to need the math to be right before the moment arrived, rather than discovering mid-moment that no one had built the right math for them. Yes, she said, I'm prepared for it. Blackwood held her gaze for a final moment. Then he leaned back against the pillow and closed his eyes briefly. Not sleep, just the deliberate rest of a man who has done what he set out to do in this conversation. Torres will have the paperwork ready by 1700, he said. Take your 2 weeks. Come back sharp. She put the chair back in its place and walked to the door. Torres was waiting in the corridor. He fell into step beside her without being asked, and they walked back through the medical bay corridor toward the main base. After a moment, he said quietly, Did you know when you were on the hill? Did you know it was going to end up here? She thought about the summit, the storm, the 9 men on the ridgeline, the first shot breaking in the gap between gusts and the 4 seconds of silence before confirmation. I knew what I had to do, she said. What came after was never the point. Torres was quiet for several steps. Then the program, designing the assessment criteria. You know what that actually means? Tell me what you think it means, she said. It means the next person who walks into a staging bay and gets laughed at because of what they look like is going to have a test they can pass that nobody can argue with, he said, because you built it, because you lived it first. He paused. That's bigger than 11 shots. She did not respond immediately. They walked through the main corridor of the medical bay and out into the light of the base, and the desert was exactly what it always was, vast, clear, stripped of every pretension. Yes, she said finally, it is. She went back to the bunk room and sat on the cot and looked at the window. The motor pool was quiet. The afternoon was moving toward evening. In the medical bay 30 meters away, Garrett Blackwood was lying in a hospital bed with a fractured femur and a formal record that was going to include a sentence he had never expected to write. A sentence that said his element was alive because a woman he had dismissed before she spoke had turned northwest at a canyon entrance and climbed a hill. Nobody authorized and made shots that doctrine said were not achievable. In the ops building, Haskell was processing paperwork that would move up through channels and generate meetings and create a framework that did not currently exist. In the common area somewhere, Kruger was sitting with a cup of coffee. He was probably letting go cold the way he had the morning he came to find her at the motor pool, working through something that was going to take more than one night to fully resolve. And Torres was writing up a report that would begin with mission parameters and end with a set of numbers that the military community would pass around for years, not as a story exactly, but as a data point. A marker, something that expanded the boundary of what the record showed was possible. Hallie sat with all of it, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, something quieter and more durable than either of those things. She thought about the night before the mission, alone in this room running the ballistic calculations for 3,000 meters in haboob conditions, checking her math, and then checking it again. The certainty she had not about the outcome, she had never been certain about the outcome, but about the preparation. The preparation was complete. It had been built correctly over years from the smallest component up. When the moment arrived, the preparation had been sufficient. That was all she had ever been trying to prove, not to them, to herself, that the work was real, that the preparation meant something, that what she had built across 6 years of training and calculation and discipline was an actual thing and not a performance of a thing. She had proven it at 3,000 meters in a sandstorm. No one could take that back. No staging bay, no dismissive remark, no preformed conclusion about what a person at 4 feet 9 inches was capable of. None of it could reach back to Hill, 350, and change what the numbers showed. The record was permanent. The confirmation was in the weather station data and the ridgeline assessment in the medical bay where 8 men were alive rather than the alternative. She lay back on the cot. Her hip ached. Her hands were still. The desert outside was going gold as the sun moved toward the horizon, and somewhere on the northern ridgeline of a canyon 40 kilometers away, the storm had left everything clean. She had walked into FOB Sentinel as the soldier they called a doll. She was leaving it as something the military did not yet have the right word for, because the category she occupied had not previously existed, and the program that would be built in the next 8 months was going to spend considerable effort finding the language for it. The language would come. The numbers already existed. 3,060 meters, 50-plus knots, 9 shots, fractured pelvis in a 3-kilometer walk in a team that came home because she had turned northwest when everyone else turned northeast. She had not needed their belief. She had needed their absence long enough to do her job. And then she had done it. The doll they had laughed at on a Tuesday morning had rewritten the doctrine by Wednesday afternoon. And she had done it not to prove them wrong, but because the math was right and the team was in danger, and there was exactly one person on that base who had prepared for that specific problem at that specific distance in those specific conditions. That person was 4 feet 9 inches tall. She had a fractured pelvis in a 2-week medical restriction, in a program to build, in a community to change, and a record that no one who had been in that staging bay on Tuesday morning was ever going to forget. Size does not determine range. Appearance does not determine accuracy. And the battlefield, which does not care about any of the things that people use to judge each other in rooms, had recorded its verdict in the only language it ever used. The numbers did not lie. They never did. And Hallie Thorne had known that longer than any of them.